Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for attending what we're calling our Housing Zoning Code Update meeting, and we'll explain more what we mean by that as we go through the presentation. I'm Susan Miller. I'm the director with the Tulsa Planning Office, and I want to introduce our staff that will be either administering or presenting the information tonight. And first of all, welcome Counselor McKee. She has been with us on this through the housing study and through all the initiatives that sort of led us here. So I appreciate her coming along and helping us however she can. So I will start by introducing staff. So if you want to go to the next slide. We have on the call, we have Travis Hulse, who is the principal planner with the Planning and Design Group in the Planning Office. So he is the one as the planning staff person that really was the project lead on the housing study. So he'll have information on that to share. Nathan Foster is a senior planner. He's been with the planning office a long time, about 7 years. So he's a senior planner. You might be familiar with him if you spend a lot of time in our office with applications to TMAPC or Board of Adjustment. And Nathan is very knowledgeable about the code, and he'll lay out those technical details. And then Amy is a planner in our office who has helped us with the presentation, and she does work. She used to work in current planning, so she used to go to the board a lot in TMAPC, and now she's working with Travis in planning and design. So that's our group for tonight. And let's see. So I want to give a little bit of a kind of a high level overview of what we're going to talk about, and Travis and Nathan will take it down to a little bit more specific level. But tonight's discussion is really going to focus on implementation measures that came out of the 2020 downtown housing study for near downtown neighborhoods. And this was to evaluate, or there was a recommendation to evaluate zoning code barriers for new housing construction. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Some of our solutions to that. The downtown housing study had specific recommendations to help facilitate what we called missing middle housing. And we had some very specific meetings in January to talk about missing middle housing, really focused in those or toward those neighborhoods near downtown, because that's really where the overlay is proposed for those neighborhoods that surround downtown that were subject to the housing study. So we've met with them. We met with them on Monday. That presentation, I'm not sure if it's available right now on our website, but it will be available on our website, just like this one will be in a day or two. And so this group, this was a citywide sort of invitation to come and listen to the presentation tonight. There are, of course, the overlay will be specific, at least initially, to those areas near downtown. But there are a few minor changes that are more broadly applicable that Nathan will go over. So we wanted to highlight those tonight and make sure you understand and you understand those changes for when it appears on the TMAPC agenda on June 2nd. So if you want to follow along or see what these changes are, you can go to our website at tulsaplanning.org/housing. And it will have all of the changes, and the vast majority of the changes are really in the overlay, which is not applicable more broadly as the few that we're really going to focus on tonight. And as I said, we're going to videotape this meeting. We'll have it on our website, so those people that couldn't come tonight can view that, and of course contact us if they have any questions. So this is a webinar format Zoom meeting. And how this will work is we'll get through the information. It's not going to take us a long time. I think we have about 12 slides or so. So we'll get through the information. As we are going through it, any questions you have, please put in the Q&A function on this webinar. As they come in, we will either answer those as we go, or we will wait until the end and we'll answer them. But we'll try to address any questions and clarify any information that you need, whatever comments you have. That's the format of this presentation. So that is it for me for now. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Travis.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I think we've met and talked with most of you, hopefully, a number of times over the past year and a half, probably even long before then, in some of our small area plans that we've done and just other planning initiatives throughout the city. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time just highlighting the housing study. As Susan mentioned, what really kind of restarted the conversation around housing. That was an effort really looking at these specific neighborhoods highlighted on your screen, trying to understand the market dynamics going on in many of these neighborhoods. If you live there or if you visited any of the neighborhoods surrounding downtown, you've noticed a couple of things. You've noticed vacant lots, you've noticed abandoned homes, boarded up homes. You maybe even noticed some new housing going in. So the housing study was really looking at all of those dynamics and trying to understand what the market demand looked like over the next 10 years or so for this specific area. So we had a consultant that came in town and spent a lot of time looking at those pieces and components, talking with many people across the community, local builders, residents, property owners, bankers, lenders, you name it. We really tried to get a holistic view of that. And at the end of that, I think we had a list of actions to really help address what we felt like was an opportunity and a desire of many of the people. I won't say everyone, but many of the people that lived in these neighborhoods looking for a couple of things, specifically housing options, seeing something more than maybe what's there today. Housing affordability was a big conversation, and even just efficient use of our existing city infrastructure. Many of these neighborhoods already have water, sewer, streets, you name it. So wanting to, really kind of focus on that. One of the priority actions that came out of that recommendation to really start moving the needle and seeing some good progress in these neighborhoods was removing barriers to what Susan mentioned as missing middle infill development. We've spent a lot of time over the past year or so continuing those conversations and starting to understand what types of tools are available. Are there barriers? If there are, what can we do to resolve those? And we've really been looking at the zoning code specifically. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. The housing study geography that you see, that really has one specific tool that we've started to develop, which is an overlay. And then more broadly applicable citywide is really just a couple of minor tweaks to the zoning code that we feel like are necessary and will really be responsive to even things that we've heard from the broader city at large and not just these neighborhoods specific to the housing study. The comprehensive plan predates when this housing study was done in 2020. And many of our small area plans similarly completed before the housing study talked about some of these same goals and visions for a mix of housing types, addressing things like low income workforce, affordable housing. And this was a citywide conversation. I think that we really saw and heard many of these same sentiments as we released surveys, as we had conversations like this virtually. Back then, we actually got to meet in person a little bit more. So we had those conversations in person. But when we talk about those different ideas, things that were identified even citywide, missing middle is just kind of this graphic you see here on the bottom of your screen, thinking about these different housing options that fit somewhere in between a detached home and a low to mid-rise apartment. So that's kind of what we're thinking about, what we're talking about. And that was really, again, focused just on those neighborhoods within the housing study boundary. So we're going to talk a little bit about that overlay, just so you're aware of it and you know what that is. If it's something that you are interested in your neighborhood, then this will be helpful to you as something that you can understand, maybe being something applicable to where you live. Right now, we really just envision that being for those neighborhoods that were included in the housing study. And then we're also going to talk about citywide, just a couple of amendments that we also want to mention to you that we think will address a couple of things. And Nathan will get into those specifics here shortly.
Thanks, Travis. I want to really talk about two separate efforts that Travis and Susan have both touched on just a little bit. The first thing I'm going to go into, and it's outlined on the screen as is today, are the citywide zoning implications or zoning changes that we've talked about and are proposed as a part of this effort. The overlay is something I'm going to cover next, and that'll talk more about the specific changes we're discussing for those near downtown neighborhoods that we've engaged with and talked with through the housing study. So when it comes to the citywide zoning updates, there's a few things that we wanted to clarify. I know that in some of the correspondence we've received leading up to these meetings and even some of the discussions online about what these meetings were about, there seemed to be a little bit of confusion about what was being applied specifically to those areas around downtown versus what we were talking about on a citywide basis. So the first point we wanted to clarify was that we're not making changes citywide to what permitted uses there are in those underlying zoning districts or what's permitted in your neighborhood today. Currently in single family residential neighborhoods around town, the use of like a duplex or a townhome is only allowed by a special exception that requires a public hearing through the Board of Adjustment, mailings to surrounding neighbors to ensure that everyone's aware of the hearing, and obviously the reception of feedback regarding that use and its appropriateness within that neighborhood. So that's the one thing we want to really emphasize tonight, is that on a citywide basis, we're not talking about making changes to those permitted uses. We're sticking with what's in the code today, and the special exceptions that exist today are still in there and will require those public hearing processes in single family neighborhoods. So we don't want anyone to be alarmed that all of a sudden there is just this, floodgate of new opportunity within those neighborhoods. There are still the restrictions that exist today. We're just making a few tweaks to some of the underlying restrictions to actually, in what we believe, help some of the neighborhoods ensure that if one of these was approved by a special exception or through that process, that it can fit more appropriately within the neighborhood and stick to the character of the neighborhood instead of somewhat standing out. So to do that, we started with the lot and building regulations that we have in our code. And the website that Susan mentioned is really helpful in this regard. If you would like to look at the very specific changes that we're making, you can click on the citywide link and look at a chart that highlights the very different changes we're making to that overall chart. And one of the things you'll start to see is what we're doing is really just duplicating the lot and building regulations for duplexes to match what a single family home would comply with on the same lot. And I think one of the things that happened when we were adopting our new zoning code is we brought some of the regulations from our older zoning code forward, and we're realizing today that those actually cause worse implications for the neighborhood if one of these are approved or if something was to occur, because of the fact that they require larger lots and larger setbacks. They really detract from the neighborhood and the character of what that neighborhood has. So we started by reducing all of the minimum lot and building regulations just to align directly with the single family homes. So previously a 9,000 square foot lot, for example, would have been required to build a duplex, whereas today in an RS3 neighborhood, 6,900 square feet would be the minimum lot area for that, which means that it would match those other lots on the same street that have single family homes on them. In addition to that, that had to reduce lot width, because one of the things the code said was if you're in an RS3 neighborhood building a duplex, you had to have 75-foot wide lot, while single family homes only had to have 60-foot wide lots. And so by aligning those together, what we're doing is really trying to ensure that this character is just matched and it can really fit within these neighborhoods where those approvals are given, once again, through the Board of Adjustment and with a public hearing before anything was actually allowed. The additional setback requirement under the third bullet point is something that's applied to other special exceptions. So there's a range of things that can be approved through a special exception in a single family neighborhood, and you see them around town today, like churches and parks, some of the other things like public and civic institutional uses. Those things, schools, they can all go into existing neighborhoods through a special exception. And if any of you live in neighborhoods near one of those uses, you may have received notice in the past if they tried to change something on their site plan or do something differently. That additional setback is what we want to apply to those special exception uses to ensure there's proper buffering and space between something that's really not a residential use within a neighborhood and does require that additional spacing. So that 25-foot setback is going to be applied to any of those other approved special exceptions, but not to anything like a residential use. Again, just because we want those to fit better into the neighborhood. On cottage house developments, we're really only dealing with the lot area requirement. And that comes from really a lot of discussions we've had with neighborhoods who think the idea of cottage houses on vacant lots and things would prove to be a very successful concept. But our code was extremely prohibitive when it came to the lot area. And so we've reduced the lot area on those requirements only in areas where cottage houses would have been permitted before. Again, not changing where they're permitted today or adding those to a list of permitted uses anywhere else. On street setbacks in multifamily districts, and I think it's important to say this is multifamily districts only. This is not if someone were to build something in a different district like a single family or otherwise. So within those multifamily districts, what we've ran into a lot is developers or someone building a new apartment building, but not really being able to comply with the recommendations of our own adopted plans and policies, and bringing that building up to the street, or maybe making it a more active street, especially along arterial streets where you see like major street thoroughfares, and oftentimes you want to have a more active streetscape and a transparent front of the building. So what that led to was a lot of times apartment buildings being pushed farther back on lots where they were allowed, and parking lots being put in between the building and the street, which really doesn't help create a more active streetscape or a more safe feel along the neighborhood. Instead, it just puts cars out on the street between the buildings. So we reduced those setbacks within the multifamily districts only along the streets, so that buildings could be placed at least at a minimum 10 feet from the street, not requiring them to be, but still providing that flexibility in situations where it made sense to match that existing street edge without reducing any of the rear yard setbacks or the side yard setbacks that would have already had to have been complied with today. The final citywide change that we're tweaking right now is just the townhome in RS4 specifically. That's the only district. So if you're in any other neighborhood, nothing is changing for you with regards to townhomes. But if you look at that chart that's available on our website, what it shows you is that in most cases, we allowed at least 2 townhomes to fit within one approvable lot in that underlying zoning. With the exception of RS4, there was a restriction there that said they had to be at least 30 foot wide, while an RS4 single family home could be on a lot that was only 50 feet wide. And so what we try to do is align those so that we can make 2 townhomes fit on that single lot. So reducing it by 5 feet aligns it with just every other district where townhomes are approved. So that's really the breakdown of those citywide changes that we're talking about, and those things that would impact anyone outside the boundary that Travis showed you earlier, and that I'm going to show you again in the next few slides as we talk about the overlay itself. But again, we just want to make sure everyone is aware that we're not going out and exclusively changing uses that are allowed in neighborhoods. Everything is still subjected to a public hearing if it was subjected to a public hearing before. It's just about making sure that those underlying requirements really align with what we want to see if something is approved in those neighborhoods. So with that, I think I'll move to our next few slides where we're going to talk really more about the overlay tool. And again, this is applied only to the areas you see now on the screen, or proposed, I'm sorry, for those areas on the screen. And the reason for that is we've had a lot more conversations with these specific neighborhoods. They've been engaged with us through the housing study. We've had additional conversations with them since that time as we've developed this overlay to discuss the idea of missing middle. And another thing that's unique to this area that's not probably the case in other neighborhoods in town is that a lot of these uses already exist. So we're talking about areas where really there's a lot of buildings sitting currently not compliant with existing zoning regulations that probably deters some folks from making larger investments on those properties and making sure that they are maintained correctly because of that concern that they're not actually compliant with the zoning. And if something were to happen, that use wouldn't be able to be reestablished. So what we were trying to do is really align our zoning regulations in this very specific geography with what exists today and what those neighborhoods have told us they'd like to see more of within that boundary. So within the overlay, we had to develop really a purpose. And I think the next slide covers some of the key elements of that purpose within the overlay. And it comes straight from the housing study that Travis explained a little bit of earlier. And that's about trying to provide a more diverse use of housing, trying to bring up to compliance those existing structures that are there today, adding choices for people who want a different type of housing that maybe isn't as present in the city of Tulsa today, and ultimately making better use of the public infrastructure that we all pay for and that exists already in these areas to ensure that we can add additional units to the existing water and sewer and streets and sidewalks that are already there without continuing to spend money on expansion and growth of that infrastructure in other places. This is all a component of implementing those additional plans and studies that have all been done through the city of Tulsa and that have received really an overwhelming amount of feedback from those existing neighborhoods. So the specific changes within the overlay itself gets a lot more broad than what we talked about citywide. These are, in fact, changes to what are the permitted uses, as well as those additional underlying regulations that we talked about changing citywide with some extra tweaks within the overlay area specifically. So as we receive feedback on what type of housing existed in these neighborhoods, as well as what people felt was appropriate, we began to audit our zoning code to understand what we were doing to prohibit or restrict those uses in those neighborhoods, because the last thing we wanted to do was be a reason why this stuff that we've obviously seen is demanded for in these areas, but also highly valuable in these areas. We didn't want to create barriers to that within our zoning code. So we checked out our use table and we essentially brought in all the building types that were part of that study and were recommended as part of that study and created those as by right uses within those near downtown neighborhoods. Like I said before, this one removes non-compliance issues for those that are already existing, but also does provide opportunities where there are vacant lots and other underdeveloped lots to be reactivated and repurposed into these types of uses that before would be totally restricted. In addition to having to allow our uses, we needed to look more at those lot and building regulations that were set up really for the city as a whole, and that we talked about amending just minorly earlier. The overlay tool works very well to go in and tailor standards to a specific geography, knowing that our code it's very hard to have a one size fits all code for a city like Tulsa that has such a variety of building types and designs. So the overlay allowed us to go in and make even more tweaks to those underlying lot and building regulations to not only allow for more of these uses that we've talked about, but to also bring into compliance existing properties and homes and things within these neighborhoods that don't meet the regulations that exist today because they were platted or developed much earlier than the regulations were developed. So there's a snippet on the screen of just an example of that, where you see a whole row of 47-foot, 50-foot, 40-foot lots in an older neighborhood in town, whereas today our code would say that neighborhood needs to have at minimum a 60-foot lot. And so by creating those existing issues, we're really adding undue burden to citizens of Tulsa who would like to have those properties that they can have confidence have the ability or opportunities that they see on them. The last change we made within the overlay district itself has to do with parking. And when you get nearer to downtown and you have more access to the bike lanes that we have now, the bus rapid transit that we have now, ultimately what happens is our zoning code begins to over-prescribe parking for uses like townhouses and duplexes and cottage houses. So within those downtown neighborhoods, it became obvious to us that we probably needed to reduce and tailor those parking requirements to the needs and the demand of that area, just as we had done with the other regulations. Otherwise, a lot of times what you end up with are a place where one of these uses makes a lot of sense and can provide a lot of value, but the parking lot just to serve it ends up eating up more than half the lot, and they end up not being able to do the project, or in the alternative, looking to buy other land to either demolish existing structures or otherwise to find room for that required parking. So what we did was go in and we reduced in the overlay area only the parking requirements for all the specified uses by 50%, and essentially aligned our parking to be one parking space per unit versus what would mostly be over one or two parking spaces per unit before those changes would be adopted. So that really covers the specifics of the neighborhood infill overlay. Like we've said many times, the website covers these in a lot more detail. It highlights all those changes. It shows you what it is and what it's going to. So we invite you guys to look at that website, to check out those proposals. And obviously later in the conversation, we're going to share our contact information with you and provide you the opportunity to get in touch with us if you have more questions about that you don't get out today or that we don't answer today for you. So we welcome you to do that as well. In the next slide, I am passing it off to Travis. Looks like he's turning the screen on, so he's going to talk to us a little bit about what the schedule looks like from here on out.
So one of the things that's been the most important as a part of this conversation is Nathan's been laying out what this overlay tool looks like for those neighborhoods versus citywide amendments we're looking at is all of the input that we've received throughout this process. And again, that started long before even the housing study. I can't emphasize that enough. But that's really what prompted us to move forward with this tool is something that we felt like was responding to the wishes and the desires of the people who live in those neighborhoods close to downtown. And I'll say that even in those conversations, July 2020, you see on your screen, we launched a survey that was citywide. I think we started to hear interest from folks outside of the downtown neighborhoods about some of those same things, but we didn't have quite the degree of conversations with every neighborhood citywide as we did with those neighborhoods around downtown. So we're really focusing on those neighborhoods, having had a lot of conversations with the people that live there. We would encourage folks to reach out to us if you do find interest in that overlay tool as something that might be applicable to the neighborhood that you live in. But that's really what it would take is a lot of neighborhood support and the people who live there to even consider something like that being applied outside of the area that we've really kind of focused on. And, of course, of all of these conversations, we do our best. I can't say that we're perfect in all of our outreach, but talking with the counselors, talking with the folks who live there, who are invested in these neighborhoods, home builders was an important conversation to us. We can talk about removing barriers in the zoning code, but if people who actually build these structures and finance these projects aren't willing to do those things, then we just don't know that there's a whole lot of purpose there. But we've had a lot of great conversations with them, understanding some of the barriers that they see and at the same time, the interest that they have and wanting to work with these types of housing options and had some good conversations. So, over the past year and a half, we've had a lot of talk. We kind of had our January, February Planuary events that many of you probably participated in. That was even a little bit more broad than this conversation where we were talking about infill that could be residential, it could be commercial, could be really different types of uses, and how that could maybe influence the update to the comprehensive plan. So we've been trying to have this conversation in a very broad sense, and then also at a very kind of finite level detail within those surrounding neighborhoods. So hopefully tonight is giving you a sense of kind of where those tools seem to fit and how they can work, why we're really focusing on those neighborhoods included in the housing study around downtown, and then also a couple of the amendments that we're going to be proposing to the Planning Commission here in June that will make their way to City Council there shortly after. So Susan's going to talk about kind of those next steps in the process for approval and really more formally what that looks like and how you can get plugged into that as well.
Okay, so this is where we are now. We're in May. We're re-engaging with neighborhoods, which we're talking, broadly to all of you tonight. We re-engaged with those specific neighborhoods on Monday. We've built this website that has all of that information for you to review and everyone to review in advance of the June 2nd TMAPC public hearing. And we will be presenting these to TMAPC. We have presented them to TMAPC in various levels of detail. It's been a process to work through them, work with legal, work with neighborhoods, work with people that are interested in doing this kind of housing. So we've talked to them a few times about it. When it goes to public hearing in June, there will be several ways that you can participate or provide input in that. You could, of course, attend the meeting, and most of you probably know that's in council chambers in City Hall, June 2nd, starting at 1 o'clock. You can either attend in person. You can also provide us written comments at at incog.org, and we will share those with the commission. And so that will, of course, they provide recommendation to council. And then those are text amendments. So really right now, this phase is not applying it to any specific neighborhood. This is really just putting that in the code, those text and those regulations that Nathan went over in the code that will be the next step applied to a certain geography. And even though we have those sort of those conceptual maps that we showed, there's still further discussion to have there. And we're still going to be talking, and that's what the council will need to initiate some kind of geography, and then probably maybe even a little more broad than we end up with, because we need to go into those neighborhoods again and talk with property owners and just get down to a finer grain of detail about who's in, who's out, what the edges look like. That's the process we have used on the other overlays that we've adopted, the Route 66 overlay, the river design overlay. And it's a process that takes a while, but in both cases, we've had really good results and the property owners have been happy. So that's our next step. And then TMAPC will probably be seeing and considering those map amendments in October. And we hope that everything that is adopted is in effect by the end of the year. So this is our contact information. Again, the housing webpage is tulsaplanning.org/housing. So Nathan, Travis, and I will field the questions. Let's see. Let me start with this one. I started to answer, and some things are just easier to talk about. So someone asked, are you talking about tearing down historic housing that could be refurbished? Absolutely not. We would never do that. We would never want that, for sure. The zoning code really, there's a lot of things in the city that are historic that aren't necessarily have a historic zoning designation or even a national register designation or things like that. But I mean, I know, speaking broadly on behalf of our office, we would always support keeping existing housing and trying to keep the character of the neighborhoods as opposed to tearing things down and changing that character. So this doesn't facilitate any kind of demolition or anything like that. The zoning code actually doesn't deal with demolition at all. The only thing that's a little bit is, of course, the historic preservation zoning does at least have a process to review demolition before that happens in historic preservation zone neighborhoods. But other than that, demolition is a building permit process. The zoning code does not really speak to it at all.
Just as a follow-up to those points, Susan, that goes to some of the points I made about the overlay area and those existing buildings that are there today that exist out of compliance or grandfathered into our existing zoning regulations. This would assist those in being more compliant uses within the neighborhoods and hopefully create more desire to invest in those properties and bring them back to life because of the fact that there wouldn't be an extensive zoning process involved in doing that. So we had the first question submitted here. Kate had asked about a 6,700 square foot lot. You referenced 11th Street in North Main. It says near the Heights, though, in Cheyenne Park. So I was trying to determine kind of where that was, but I wasn't able to really locate that. But if you're within those areas that we've shown on the map, and I think we might want to provide a little more clarity to everybody on the boundaries. There's been several kind of people who've asked really what those boundaries were.
One of the things we have is actually a interactive map. You can put your address in and it'll tell you if you're in the overlay or not.
So I responded to Terry to kind of explain that eastern boundary is Utica. So as you look at it, that ends Riverview Cherry Street. That's only the north side of 15th Street going east, to Utica Avenue. So that's where that boundary stops. The southern boundary for that portion just to the west there in the Riverview area, that's the part I didn't know the specific street. I think it's about 21st Street where that southern boundary lands there. So that was one of the other questions that was submitted. But to Kate's question, the one that we have on the screen, if you were located within these areas or these geographies near downtown, it says you're near the Heights, then that would assist you in that particular request. The reduction of the lot area to meet with duplexes in those overlay boundaries would remove some of those things that are currently preventing you from building a duplex on that particular lot because of the way that we've changed those lot and building regulations. So I definitely encourage, if you have more questions about that or you want to get more specific, then you can definitely reach out to me and we can talk more about the specifics of that lot, and you might be able to give me the address so I can find what actually is going on there.
It looks like the southern boundary is 18th Street.
So the next one was about parking. Within those overlay areas, we do have a reduction stated of 50% in the parking. We have talked to the neighborhoods about that. I think there is obviously a preference to see the reactivation of a lot of those buildings and repurposing of some of those structures over seeing more parking lots. As you guys all probably know, parking lots are pretty detrimental to neighborhoods, and it's not something that you want to incorporate into some of those uses. In a lot of those neighborhoods today, there is parking allowed on one side of the street at least, or other sides. And so, yes, I think there may be, more kind of moving street parking if people are visiting people in those units or coming by. But I think that's kind of what that's intended for. But by requiring still that minimum level of parking to support the use itself, I think we will kind of avoid any of a negative impact on that otherwise. To Betch Mickey's question about just a novice wanting to kind of learn more about zoning and the zoning language, we have a lot of resources on our website. If you go to tulsaplanning.org, there's literally a resources tab actually that has some frequently asked questions pertaining to zoning, can kind of give you some guidelines on how zoning works and how it applies to your property. So I would definitely recommend checking that out, and of course, reaching out to us if there's specific questions that we can help you with.
I'm not super familiar with some of the local streets. Nathan, is Marshall and Main?
Yes, Marshall and Main would be included within the overlay area. They're currently zoned RS4 and outside the historic preservation boundary of the Heights, but it's just right to the northeast of the Heights. Marshall is actually the northern boundary of the Heights.
Question about understanding correctly that neighborhoods directly outside of the housing study area could still be included. If decided during a community input phase, I would say yes. And that's something that we're really haven't put a lot of thought into as far as, us leading that effort. We wanted to present this as kind of the first chance for people to see what the overlay was all about, so that if you felt like that maybe that made sense for a neighborhood that wasn't included within that kind of initial boundary, that you could start to really think about that and consider whether or not that could be something at a future phase to be included within that overlay. And we would definitely want the community input to be initiated that way through broad support from the community in order to apply anything like that overlay or any of the other overlays that we have available in the zoning code.
So how I see like this first phase going is that we will determine some kind of, based on the neighborhoods that were part of the near downtown study, some geography that the council can initiate. And, once they initiate it, we really can pull it in. We probably can't expand it. So we'll need to get with counselors and talk through that, but then kind of chip away at the edges or do whatever we need to do after we talk with those property owners and everything. So I think adding properties that are on the edges of that or surrounding it, I think entirely new neighborhoods that are especially in other parts of the city, I think that's a neighborhood initiative that will require a lot of work on behalf of those neighborhood residents, and that would definitely come at a later time when the neighborhood might be ready to do that. But this is really, it's going to be generally limited, but there's still a lot of wiggle room around the edges that we need to figure out.
I think a lot of what you're saying in response to that one, Susan, answers Pamela Gotcher's question too about once we've adopted this and it's in place, how flexible are the boundaries? How would they be subject to change? It's a full-blown rezoning process. It's not something that could just be done by the council or by anyone without engagement of the property owners within that neighborhood well in advance. There would, as Susan mentioned, really, I agree with you. There are lots of neighborhoods in the city of Tulsa where this does not make any sense. And we wouldn't pursue this as a rezoning or something to be adopted within those neighborhoods. That would be something that really, once we've adopted what we've learned through the housing study, we would rely more on neighborhoods to initiate their own overlays or their own desires through that process if there was going to be any sort of expansion of this. So I wouldn't want anyone to be concerned that just because we've adopted this first phase of this, that somehow that all of a sudden becomes some sort of citywide change or has implications citywide. There would be a very extensive process before that would ever be adopted in new neighborhoods. And most of the time it would have to be initiated by the neighborhood itself for that to happen. Kate, I saw that you posted your address and I looked it up, and you guys would be included in the overlay district as proposed. So please feel free to kind of reach out to us after this and take down our contact info, and we can talk to you more about what you guys are looking at on that particular property. To Sarah's question, she asked to kind of more describe the cottage house development as it was in our zoning code. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull up for myself here a description of that so we can kind of talk more about it. But the cottage house development is the idea that you could arrange smaller single family homes around a common space, putting the driveways in the rear of the homes and having rear entry garages while maintaining kind of a green or village type style. They're limited to, I believe it's 4 units, if that's achievable in the code. And that's where those lot areas and the lot area per units come in, because you do have to have a fairly significant lot in order to accommodate something like that. But it does create more of a village style feel. It's still a single family home. They can still be owned separately through condo agreements, but they essentially create a feel like some of the apartments or garden apartments that we may see around town today. So that's really where that's at. And if you want more information, our zoning code kind of covers the description of those building types in full detail about what would be allowed or where they would be allowed.
As far as access to the links go, I've kind of been taking notes about a few of the things that people have asked about. So the housing study, we'll make sure to include that link. We'll make sure to include the link to the overlay map itself, so you can see very specifically street addresses and where properties fall within that initial boundary or not. And then the website that we've referenced a few times that show the proposed changes. If there's anything else that I'm forgetting, and the group of panelists here that might know what else has maybe been mentioned, but feel free to drop that in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to include links to all of those in our follow-up email, just in case you don't have access to them and we forget. So we'll make sure to do that.
Is part of Maple Ridge included was another question that was submitted. And I believe everything that we've included in this particular overlay is west of the trail, and 18th Street being that southern boundary, and that prevents any part of Maple Ridge, the neighborhood, being actually included. So no. Street parking, with regards to Owen Park, we've had a lot of conversations with our streets and stormwater folks as well to discuss where there is not available street parking. And one of the early considerations when we were adopting this proposal was to consider allowing on-street parking to be counted. And we did remove that from our proposal after learning that there was limited street parking in most of these neighborhoods already. A detached homes parking requirement isn't being amended. Actually, it's only for those other uses that we've talked about. So a detached house would still be required to provide at minimum 2 spaces, while some of those more multifamily structures or townhomes, duplexes would be under that limitation of 1. I will say that is just a minimum. It's not something that's required that they only provide that many spaces. So as someone is doing construction and developing something on a lot, this would be an opportunity for them to still provide more parking. We just don't want to make our mandate over require what they know their demand to be.
Susan, on this next question, timing of overlay, did you mention when we thought kind of by, there's a lot of pieces to this, so it's hard to say, but did you say end of the year?
We've estimated that the map amendment could probably get to TMAPC in about October. And if that's the case, then it could probably be in effect by about the end of this year.
To Trevor's question, I really hope that the research we've done and the stuff we've learned through the engagement with these neighborhoods and the housing study that was performed on these areas would show us that these changes may help, in fact, low-income families in a way that provides a diversity of housing and removes restrictions that would only allow exclusively detached single-family homes that are often way more expensive than some of those other types of housing. So our overall goal here is to really try and diversify that housing market so that multiple income levels and different housing types can be provided near downtown and ensure that people have access to those transit lines and those resources that are available in those areas.
So similar to adding neighborhoods, but maybe the opposite of potentially removing neighborhoods from the overlay. I think thus far, the feedback that we've received has been overall positive from the folks that live in the neighborhoods that we've talked about so far. If there's, similarly concerns from anyone of you in this meeting or other meetings that come to the public hearing and or just even submit those concerns to us ahead of time, we would include that as a part of the consideration for the Planning Commission and those decision makers. So the answer is yes, the neighborhoods or portions of neighborhoods could be taken off. And I think that'll be a part of the second phase of the map amendments, really understanding what that boundary looks like specifically and making sure that we've included those areas that there's broad support from the neighborhoods to include.
So if that does include you or anyone you know that you live in those neighborhoods, make sure you stay in close contact with us and let your city councilor know, because as I believe it was Nathan said, it is a rezoning. So to take an overlay off of your property is another rezoning. So we don't want to include an area that there's not broad neighborhood support to include. So just make sure that we're communicated with very clearly, and the counselor, and we'll work with you on that.
At the moment, the minimum lot requirement for a 4-unit cottage complex is 15,000 square feet. So, roughly a third of an acre. The proposal to reduce those lot areas takes it to 10,000 square feet. So just basically going from a third down to about a fourth of an acre to still 4 units around that common village space. And that's the minimum amount of units you can have in a cottage house development. To Lori's question, there are currently no RS2 zoned areas included in the overlay boundary. It would be kind of going back to our previous points in the future. If a neighborhood wanted to initiate that for their own boundary, the city would, facilitate that process with consent from all of the owners, and they could take it through a process to adopt something like that. But at the moment, that's not a proposal we have, and there's not any RS2 zoning within the area we're proposing for. So that would be a later rezoning if it were to happen. To Tracy's question, for a 4-unit apartment within the overlay itself, you would have 4 parking spaces required. No on-street parking could be counted to meet that requirement. Outside of the overlay area, if someone were to propose an apartment, it would be basically tied to first how many bedrooms each unit were within that apartment complex. But within an apartment, a 0 to 1 bedroom unit will require 1.25 spaces, so 1 1/4. So if you added 4, then you're at 5 spaces total for the overall building. And then beyond that, you start to require 2 spaces per unit if there's more than 1 bedroom. So it would all just depend on that particular zoning and what the proposed configuration of those units was. To Don's question, when we went through the engagement of the overlay process with the neighborhoods that are included, we originally had a 12-unit apartment max proposed that was revised and taken back down to only an 8-unit allowance. There was some more openness on the parking requirements that we changed, and also some new additions, including a prohibition on putting a parking lot between a building and the street to ensure that the building really interacted with the neighborhood street versus having a parking lot there. There was some concerns to do with existing infrastructure, including flooding and stormwater and things of that nature that we discussed, and understand that when someone pursues any type of development like that through the city of Tulsa, there are other ordinances and guidelines in place for how that infrastructure has to be treated, as well as any potential improvements that have to be made. So we think as we've listened through that we've addressed a lot of those concerns in the draft that we have. And there may still be, of course, some objection. You never get 100% of approval from anyone, but we do think we've come up with an appropriate response and something that can really help these neighborhoods.
So to Pam's question about the balance of input, I think in this process specifically that we've received from developers and builders in comparison to people that either own property in these neighborhoods or residents of these affected neighborhoods don't have specific numbers per se. I think we've maybe had a couple of conversations with developers and builders and probably had 3 times as many with the affected residents, just as a general statement. I feel pretty confident saying that. The residents have been our priority in this conversation, and really engaging with the developers and builders has been more to understand from a construction side of things, have they seen barriers to building a duplex or a townhome or any of these housing options that we thought made sense to include within the overlay. So the conversations have been a little bit different, more to be specific about their expertise. But I feel like our resident input and their involvement in this conversation has been probably more so than those conversations that we've had with the local development community.
So even just to add on to that, when the map amendment is initiated, we want to re-engage those neighborhoods. So those of you who have lived within 300 feet of a zoning proposal and received a letter, well, in a case of an overlay, we'll be notifying everyone within the proposed area of an overlay and 300 feet. So we are going to send that letter out so far in advance that they can see their option for more neighborhood discussion and meetings with us, plus the TMAPC hearing. So we still have a lot of conversations to have with them before a map amendment or boundary is finalized. So there's still a lot more neighborhood conversations to have too.
I'm just answering some of these other questions about the overlay. I typed in some answers. Somebody asked what the new lot size needed was for duplexes in the overlay area, which would be 4,000 square feet. To Tracy's question here, same general vein, what's the lot size needed for a fourplex? So for a multi-unit house, if that's how it was designed, which really kind of gets into the details of the zoning code, if you design that fourplex in a way that has a single street entrance and looks more like a single family home in nature of its character, that would be still 4,000 square feet. And then with an apartment complex, you'd have 4,000 square feet with some additional open space requirements as well.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions.
We've received some other comments too, and we've seen those. We appreciate those. You can contact us. Our contacts right there on the page. Any one of us is free, either phone or email.
Thank you. And we really do, we have our internal group that we meet and go through all of these things and just kind of double check ourselves or make adjustments accordingly. So we really do take all of this into consideration. Helps us do our job better. So thank you. And I guess that's it. So thanks. I think you guys helped us be very efficient in this information and answering your questions. But don't be shy. Let us know if you think about anything else after you have a chance to look at everything on the website. And like Travis said, I don't know if it's going to be Travis or whoever, we'll follow up with the video and some websites that we talked about, information. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.